Hi, I'm George Nordhaus, and welcome to Monday Morning Markets. Here's a product knowledge video on what we think is probably the hottest coverage, the most essential one that many people don't have, and that is cybercrime or cyber liability. It is, well, everybody knows what it is in the country, but let's move forward because I will show you who's going to present it here. A picture of John Torvey, and that's me on the left. And John Tarvey is the Vice President of Marketing and Sales for Landy. And Landy is a general agency, a wholesaler, but he's a professional and knowledgeable in these coverages. So John is going to explain the coverage to us and how you might want to know more about it. And of course, at the end, you can then go right back to the agency, talk to them, and get more information, pricing, or whatever. So John, let's move forward.
Well, thank you, George. Thanks for having me on the broadcast this morning. We'll start with the obvious question, why privacy breach and cybercrime insurance? As you mentioned, it is absolutely the fastest growing threat to businesses in the world, and certainly in the United States. And the statistics are overwhelming, and I could have filled hours of this presentation with statistics, but we see as many as 3 cyber crimes per minute. Some statistics are even more scary than that. So it's something that's very pervasive amongst the businesses in our country, and no type of business, whether it's a professional service business or some other type of business, is immune from the dangers of a privacy breach or a cybercrime type of attack.
And or the Democratic Party or anybody else. I mean, it's just amazing all this stuff that's going on.
It is.
Not one day can you go back and see the anything without having something in the paper about another one. Anyway, excuse me. Go ahead.
Very true. No, very true, George. And there's a perception, and I think it's changing. I hope that hacking and all of the things that can go wrong, the bad guys are just some little outlet, some weird kid next door, somebody around the corner who's trying to get at your email. And we need to understand that the hackers, the bad guys, run extremely sophisticated operations, almost always overseas, typically from Asian countries, but from really all over the world, and very sophisticated operations where there are attempts with thousands and tens and even hundreds of thousands of computers at a time and email addresses at a time to get at us. And once they find someone who is vulnerable, then they're in. And some of the things and phraseologies that we hear and some of the things that can go wrong include phishing, which is digging for information, hacking of computers, which is to get in and control what's happening inside the computer, social engineering, which is a relatively newer phenomenon where the bad guys are actually assuming the identity of the people involved in an email chain, for example, and misappropriating escrow funds or trust funds, those kind of things. Data for ransom is something we're seeing more and more. I hear about several of these events every week, where someone comes in and steals or freezes your computer, freezes your data, and says if you give us $5,000 or $10,000, we'll let your data go, so to speak. Sabotage with disgruntled employees and competitors, and so much more. So there's a lot of very sophisticated type of attacks that are taking place.
Oh, I know. The thing I want to make about that. Asking for money because of the fact that they ransom. I mean, a number of people are just paying it, aren't they?
Unfortunately so. People are just paying it, and of course there's no guarantee that your data will be freed up once you pay. And in some ways you're creating greater risk, because now how are you paying that? You're paying that with a checking account or some bank transfer, so now the bad guys are even getting more information about you. So it begs the question, who needs the policy? Well, I mentioned at the beginning that every business needs some type of coverage. coverage. But small businesses are particularly vulnerable because they don't have the support and sophistication that Walmart and Target and the United States Department of Defense has in order to create these more sophisticated protections within their business. Mom and pop businesses, smaller businesses in our communities don't have IT staff. They don't have the sophistication and the resources. So small businesses are particularly vulnerable to computer crime. And one of the things that I hope all of our listeners will understand is that every state in the United States has some type of data protection law and regulation that all businesses need to follow in terms of how they protect their personal data and business data. And hopefully that's a first step in prevention of a cybercrime. But it leads to the idea that if in fact there is a cybercrime and the state laws and regulations are not followed, the penalties imposed by the states can be far more significant than if in fact the business at least has a sound protection plan in place.
Where do they get those, John? Where do they get those laws? Where can they find them?
Well, typically they're in some states general law type of wherever the states keep the laws, I guess, George. Yeah. I know that in a lot of states, for example, when I look at them more seriously, I find them like in the Department of Business Regulation websites.
I got you.
Where they do list the laws, and in most cases they're very detailed about what needs to be protected, what's defined as confidential data, and so on.
Good.
So we think everybody needs the coverage, and whoops, sorry about that. We went a little too fast there. Let me go backwards here.
Okay.
Okay. So a single data breach can cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and let's talk about why. I mentioned civil fines, and it's important to note that when I mentioned each state has its own laws and regulations. If I'm a business that has clients in multiple states, for example, and I have a privacy breach, I have to respond to the laws of every single state that I do business in. And what that means is that I can receive fines from multiple states, and then further costs can include notifications, credit monitoring, forensics to see what went wrong, data restoration, even first-party liabilities, like I may get sued for what just happened. It's important to note that each state considers a breach one record, one file. So if I have 500 names that get compromised in my database, if I have a database of 5,000 names that get compromised, potentially that's 5,000 fines, 5,000 notifications, 5,000 credit monitoring. So it can get very, very expensive to respond to a data breach.
Got it.
So with that in mind, what are some of the evaluation factors? What can go wrong? Email viruses. Stolen laptops are personal communication devices. We leave them in the restaurant. We leave them in the restroom. We leave them in our car. Network hacking, social engineering, which I mentioned is something that's really taking off, in terms of those types of businesses who escrow monies, who hold other people's monies in some type of trust accounts, that kind of thing. The social engineering phenomenon is so interesting and complicated. I'm not sure we want to spend a lot of time with it, but basically it's someone who gets into your computer and monitors transactions and then becomes part of that transaction without you knowing it. And they assume your identity, they assume your logo, your colors, the way you talk, the fact that, George, you and I went golfing yesterday and how was our golf game. And eventually they take over the conversation and say, okay, now it's time to wire me the funds. Here's the routing number. And we unwittingly wire them, $100,000 in an escrow account, and the money disappears.
Oh, man.
So it's It's a real serious thing. And I put in dumpster diving here because there's a lot of old school privacy breach that's still happening, and dumpster diving
I'll be darned.
and everything related to it is still happens. So we talk about cybercrime all the time, and we forget that real paper, so to speak, real files that we may have in our briefcase in our car, that's all protected data as well.
Right.
So while I firmly believe all businesses need some type of coverage, not all businesses need all coverages. You've noted that I have drawn distinctions. I've tried to draw some distinctions between language of privacy and data breach versus cybercrime, and that's purely of my own choosing, so to speak. The insurance world, the legal world, has not really clearly defined all of those things. So for the sake of this conversation and to help folks kind of sort out what kind of insurance might be needed, for businesses that have data but don't have custodial responsibilities over other people's funds, some type of data breach, privacy breach coverage is important, and I believe necessary. But the crime component, the protection of other people's funds, may not be necessary. On the other hand, if you're the type of business that does in fact have control over other people's funds, maybe you're an accountant, a CPA who has fiduciary fund responsibility over someone's accounts, or an investment advisor, a title escrow agent, or a real estate agent who has escrow funds, then that crime component can be very, very important to have as part of your plan.
Got it.
So, and I mentioned this here a little bit. Here's just in writing, so to speak, theft of data versus theft of funds. It really can impact the cost of the insurance, and really what type of insurance is appropriate here. So, coverage, carrying cost considerations. George, it sounds like you want to ask me a question.
No, I'm learning. I'm just realizing how complicated. I mean, just the average business person out there, how difficult all this is. I mean, it's so new, and it's just overwhelming. I have my own business, obviously, and I so far have not been. Well, we were hacked a little bit, but that's another story. I'm learning. Keep going. Okay.
Yeah, no, you know, and we're all learning about this, and I think this slide begins to address that. Coverage, carrying cost considerations. The market is rapidly changing. It seems like every week there's a new carrier involved, there's new products, new filings, and a lot of that has to do with, as we mentioned, it's a huge threat, a rapidly growing threat. Our insureds need this assistance. On the other hand, there's really no history. You know, insurance is based on the idea of understanding and evaluating risk over time. We have not been able to do that. So there's really little history of product performance to really see what you know, what pricing should be, what coverages should be. So we're kind of learning as we go here, and it is probably the largest growing segment of insurance sales. So everybody who's out there listening really needs to have this as part of their portfolio. But understanding that, you know, as you mentioned, it is a complicated product. And I equate some of this to what happened maybe 20 or 25 years ago when long-term care insurance first hit the market. It was sold aggressively. There were a lot of different products. No one knew how to price it because no one had any actuarial data on this. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen that long-term care insurance is seriously changed in terms of coverage, availability, pricing, and so on. And I see the same thing happening with the privacy breach and cybercrime market as well. I think in 20 years we're going to know a lot more, but we're going to be in a totally different place. So agents and consumers have numerous options in terms of where to go and how to get this kind of coverage. That's, I suppose, a blessing and a curse in its own way, but there certainly are a lot of options available for coverage. A couple of things to keep in mind. Limits and sublimits are very complicated. Most of these policies have numerous limits and sublimits for different things, whether it's a crime, a privacy breach, a credit card payment, civil fine, credit card monitoring. You know, there's just so many options of coverage and so many limits and sublimits that we really have to pay attention to A, what our client needs, and B, what we're offering them in response. There is cybercrime insurance. There's the traditional crime bond, which in a lot of ways could be very appropriate to our clients. Again, it depends how broad their need is. And it's up to us to evaluate that, evaluate their breach options and coverage. There's plentiful coverage available. Costs will vary by carrier and industry, of course, but you know, we're seeing some minimum premiums in the $300, $400, $500 range, depending upon the industry and the geographic location. Whereas the cybercrime coverage in the bonds typically start at $1,500 or more. So, you know, there's a huge difference in cost between the data protection coverage and the cybercrime coverage. On the other hand, if I'm a title escrow agent or a real estate attorney and I've got, you know, $500,000 of other people's money in an escrow account, then I need cybercrime coverage, whether it costs $1,500 or, you know, whatever else, because we're seeing hundreds of thousands and frankly, in some cases, a couple of $1 million disappear overnight, and the FBI really has a 3 or 4 hour window to track this information, track these transfers before they just disappear into thin air. So cost is always a consideration, but the risk is significant.
Well, I think what you're heading to is your last point here, and I think it's vital. The more you talk, the more I realize that they've got to get some expertise on this thing.
It's true because you know, there's some really good carriers with some really good coverage out there. You know, I'm not sure anybody's hitting it out of the park yet, George, but I think that you know, there's some great coverage out there. But you know, we find that different carriers, like in all lines, I guess, you know, want different types of markets, you know, different types of industries. So it's important to you know, work with someone who can really access a number of different carriers. It's certainly not in any way a one-size-fits-all type of product. A couple of things I would mention in closing. Understand that what the threats are for your clients, because then you can advise them a lot more closely and properly on what they really need for coverage. Maybe even partner with a local IT firm who does some forensics, who does some security checkups, so you can, you know, maybe recommend them to your clients. Prevention is everything here, because as I mentioned, if my escrow account got hacked and somebody stole $250,000 out of it, and I immediately reported it to the FBI, which seldom happens because we don't know that right away. But even if I immediately reported it to the FBI, they've got just a few hours to try to trace it, and then it just disappears. We know that the BOPS, the business owner package, and the E&O insurance can contain riders and also options for additional coverage for things like data security breaches. Sometimes those are good options. They may cost less than a standalone policy, but the policy language is not as broad. So again, if we evaluate properly our clients' needs, we can say, hey, let's get some additional coverage on your BOP or add on to your E&O coverage. Or we may say, no, the risk that you have is too broad. The E&O coverage, no matter what your monetary limits are, the language is just not broad enough for you for your protection. But you know, it's certainly an option to review what's available on the BOP and on a E&O policy.
Well, thank you, John. That was just what we needed. I think what you did is show us the very, very complex needs here, the complex needs that most business owners wouldn't know if they were, no matter what they would know. And so I think the moral of the story, obviously, is to go back to the to the agency here, to hit the contact slide and go back to the agency, and then begin to talk, because now you have a pretty good understanding of it, I hope, and then you'll be able to go to the agent. The agent, in turn, will work with general agents, wholesalers, like with Landy, we hope, and they'll be able to really analyze everything you need, and that's the name of the game in the long run. So again, I thank you for sharing